budget being handed down tonight. People behind closed doors right now distilling this. If the government's message on this, though, is jobs, 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 Graham, to what end, from what we know so far, have they fulfilled that? With the money they're spending, is this the best bang for buck?
Well, normally, Tom, as you know, the headlines and the cartoons tomorrow would set the agenda. Most people, well, nobody really reads the budget from go to woe, but by lunchtime tomorrow, everyone has an opinion, and it comes from those front-page cartoons, TV Tonight, bit of radio, and the headlines. But strangely, many of the headlines are in this morning's paper. And the government would have been thrilled with the reception they got in the papers this morning, and then they double up tomorrow. Look, it seems to me that the tax cuts, the focus on jobs, giving business a bit of incentive, looking after apprentices and then spending big. You know, if John Maynard Keynes had been alive instead of died in 1946, the great economist would have been dancing, well, a dancing man out the front of Parliament House, because the government has decided spend big, get people buying stuff and create jobs. And that seems to be the plan. But I think the clever political thing, Tom, is not including the third tranche of tax cuts. By the look of it, Mr Albanese had relied on having that attack point tomorrow to say, well, look, Gina Rinehart and somebody else is getting tax cuts. What about, what's it mean for you? That's gone. And instead, the opposition leader has resorted to, a $2 trillion budget, and he's out there jumping up and down in the streets about a $2 million disease control centre. When he announced that in his party room yesterday, they must have been standing on the seats giving him a standing ovation. He's just odd as a scene setter. It was just really strange.
You might have fired up Bruce Hawker because he's managed to overcome, or not his technical difficulties, our ones. Bruce, what about what Graham has said? Perhaps I'll just focus on what he said about the third phase of the income tax cut. It looks as though the government doesn't want any part of this recovery plan to be caught up in ideological arguments about high-income earners getting this tax cut. It doesn't want that political fight when this is handed down, because that would still be a huge part of the headline.
That's right. So they're retreating on that issue, and there's probably some sense in doing that. And right now, I think we've really got to be talking about the national interest and, not really focusing so much on partisan issues. And I think it's in the interest of the Labor Party to be saying, well, here we go. We've got a big spending Labor-style budget to try to get us out of these problems. Yes, we've got some concessions around income tax. That's a good move. And let's see if we can kickstart the economy. I think that's the tone that Labor needs to adopt with this budget, because essentially it's a Labor budget. As you were saying earlier, Tom, imagine if it was a Labor government bringing this budget down, how they'd be screaming on the Liberal side about how big the debt is now, given that it's, I think, about four times, I think, the level that Labor left it in 2013. But as you've said, that doesn't really matter all that much, because we've got such a huge fight on our hands. I think. Right.
So the question on that, Bruce, though, the differentiation, if you like, for Labor, this is a Labor budget. Where do they pick? They've mentioned social housing. I think a lot of voters would say that's good, that's worthy, but how many votes will it sway? What job area can they hit, do you think, you're expecting Anthony Albanese to focus on Thursday evening?
Well, we're just going to have to wait and see. But I think it is all about jobs and how you create them, particularly in regional Australia. I mean, that's part of the ongoing issue for Labor internally as well, is it not? How they deal with the issue of job creation, particularly in the light of the coal industry debacle we had in 2016. So I think that's where Albanese will go. I think that's where he's comfortable. He's a former infrastructure minister. He knows that area very well, and he's very credible on it. But, I don't know that Labor has to be too differentiated on this budget. I think, if they start pushing it uphill, it'll be it'll sound incredulous. I think they just have to say, look, this is an old-style Keynesian-style budget. It's certainly not the Milton Friedman, Margie Thatcher-style budget that Frydenberg would seem to like to have, and they're his idols. It's more the sort of thing you would have seen from Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Ben Chifley or someone like that. So that, I think, is the tone that Labor should adopt. Don't try to overdo it here, because it's going to be a budget where they're doing what they're expected to do, and that's stimulate the economy.
If Labor still takes a much bigger spending approach, Graham, to the next budget, it's going to be pretty hard, isn't it, for the coalition to try to shout them down saying unsustainable debt levels?
Well, look, that's probably right. But it just seems to me that this is a budget for the times. You can worry about being more restrictive, I think, in May, when the orthodox time for the budget. But it's quite odd in Parliament House here. There's different sort of lockups to normal. Normally there's 1,000 people here in a couple of hours, a couple of thousand people at functions, not happening. But all the journos are locked up, the editors are locked up, and it'll be interesting to see what the front pages are saying. You know, if I were the editor at the moment, all locked up, I'd be planning my front page and saying something like Gloombuster or, you know, Scott the Builder, something like that, that sort of sets the tone for this budget. But the headlines tomorrow will be really interesting.